Assalamu alaikum. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special session in Afkari Taza Think Fest. I'm truly delighted and honored to be in the company of Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed, who needs no introduction. Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed is a foremost social scientist. His works on Pakistan, both in terms of his political analysis as well as historical narratives are very well known. He is author of multiple books and countless papers and articles. He's also a regular contributor to the newspapers in Pakistan uh, and elsewhere. Dr. Ishtaq Ahmed's new book is the subject of our discussion today, which is a very important and a fresh examination of Qaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah's political career, his life, and his successes, failures, and role in history. That's what the book is called. And Dr. Ishtiaq Ahmed's work, in a way, pulls many historical sources together, many of the debates, many of the questions and quandaries that surround a very important and, of course, a watershed moment in our shared history with India, and therefore the book has been rather well received. It will be published in Pakistan as well soon, and all of you can get a copy once it's out very soon, hopefully in April, by Vanguard Books. So, Dr. Ishtaq Ahmed, without further ado, I would start off by asking you a very broad question, and that is, why this book on Jinnah? I know your earlier work on partition, the role of Punjabis, and how both the sides suffered through the wounds and violence of partition. This work is builds on your earlier work as well, but it is very different in its tone, in its materials, in its overall approach. So, tell us about the idea behind the book and what prompted you to come up with this new publication.
Thank you very much, Raza Rumiji. Let me pay my compliments to you. You have been a leading light on the Pakistani journalist horizon, and so I am looking forward to the discussion today. Why this book? Well, the reason is obvious that at every stage of Jinnah's life, there is controversy surrounding him. Was he an Indian nationalist? Why did he leave Indian nationalism and move away? What was his position on the Khilafat movement? On what point did he break up with Gandhi? When did he assume the leadership of the Muslim community and steer them towards the partition of India? Or, as some deny, that he didn't even want to do that, he was using it just as a bargaining chip, which I've demonstrated and I've blasted that it has no foundations to stand on. And then I would say the contrast. Whereas on the one hand, he was able to mobilize Muslims, the amorphous Muslim community with its sects, languages, ethnicities, and get them to vote for the Pakistan demand. And then when Pakistan comes into being, we find there is a complete confusion about what sort of Pakistan did he want. And that confusion has haunted Pakistan up until now. And so the book is meant to look at all those situations and argue that it's a futile and vain attempt trying to find out what did he really want once Pakistan was created. I am arguing what he devoted his attention to, his genius to, his talent to, was to argue like a clever lawyer that Hindus and Muslims were two irreconcilable, hostile nations. And if you want peace in the subcontinent, separate them, give them separate states, and then there will be peace. And in order to mobilize Muslims all over the subcontinent, he made promises right, left, and center. And all those are presented in the book. To Pir Sahib Manki Sharif, I've quoted the 5 points where he, in a very sort of adroit manner, says that indeed, in a in a Pakistan with 75% Muslim population and members in the National Assembly or the Constituent Assembly, the Sharia would be the source of all law. And then he's on record saying that Pakistan will be a modern state, a democracy, a Muslim democracy. In some cases, he speaks about an Islamic state. So, all those statements, I have argued that once the creator of ideas are able to convince people to accept their argument, they also end up in a binding social contract. Not only the people come towards him, but he is bound by that contract. And so in Pakistan, there was no constituency in favor of a secular state. And I've shown that mainstream Muslim leaguers believed in a modern Muslim democracy, whereas the right wing, as we know, has capitalized on the opportunism and so on of the Muslim modernists and have in the process brought in the Islamic State more and more. But Jinnah being secular and Jinnah wanting a secular Pakistan is a figment of the imagination. If that were the argument, we need not have had a partition in which 1 million at least people were killed, 14 to 15 million uprooted from their homes and had to cross the border for safe sanctuary. After that, Pakistan could not have been India B. That's absurd. Pakistan needed to be some sort of a Muslim state as Jinnah had promised. All this has come to haunt Pakistan, and you know that, and I know that.
Yes, Dr. Saab, that's indeed a very interesting and complex time of history that we are dealing with. And you've devoted a whole chapter to Jinnah's August 11th speech, which, many of us now cite as perhaps his announcement to have a moderate or a progressive Pakistan where religion and state were going to be separate. So you also kind of counter that, and then you have another chapter in your book which looks at other statements that you alluded to in your earlier comment.
Right.
So, what do you make of the August 11th speech? Because I'm starting with the questions that are kind of intriguing us even to after 72 years of partition and independence. This direction of Pakistan. What is Pakistan to be? Even it's still a contested idea. It's not resolved. So, your thoughts about that, and then I will move back a bit back into the history so that we can trace some of the things that led to 11th August and later.
Okay. Thank you very much. Well, let me admit, like you, I mean, I'm the senior. I also thought that the 11th August speech was a secular covenant of Muhammad Ali Jinnah. For me to go back, revisit it, and analyze it in the light of what he had been saying for 7 years, day in and day out, and then to make sense of it, that's how I now say that the 11th August speech, if read just as a speech, it is more secular than any statement made by the Indian National Congress. It's very clear. Hindus will cease to be Hindus and Muslims will cease to be Muslims, not in a religious sense, but as citizens of the state. A stronger statement in the support of a secular state cannot be imagined. But how come he does it on the 11th of August and there is no follow up speech, not even one? And that's where I think I need your attention because, okay, the first 7 years, some people argue was only to bring about the division to create Pakistan, and then it was justified. I would call it a Machiavellian way of explaining politics, but granted, that's how politics is. And Jinnah was entitled to do it like any other politician, fine. But what are the consequences once Pakistan comes into being? He realized that if now In East, you have read my book on the Punjab partition. I mean, it's the most
Yes.
well-known work of mine. Already on, by August, July, let me very briefly, for the sake of the people who don't know it. In March 1947, communal rioting started in the Punjab, and it was concentrated mostly in the Muslim majority northern, northwestern districts, in which, especially in Rawalpindi, there was a massacre of Sikhs. Okay, and then until July, no attacks took place on Muslims in eastern Punjab. But once they started happening, they were better organized. Those people were better armed, even. There were princely states involved. So, in the end, there was complete ethnic religious cleansing of the two parts of Punjab. But we are talking about 11th August. By early August, attacks from in East Pakistan were now taking place in a massive manner. And on the 12th of August, but the 12th of August we needn't mention because 11th August, 9th
Yes.
of August, there was an attack on the Pakistan special train coming to Pakistan from Delhi. So it was very clear that if now Muslims are going to be pushed out of East Punjab, if this were to happen to all the Muslims spread in India, Pakistan will end up having 35 million Muslims to take care of, even if we expel all the Hindus and Sikhs which were on our side, and they didn't exceed more than 6.5 million. So if you look at the number of people who would go and come in, it was a massive imbalance. 35 million, let's say 30 million would come to West Pakistan, which at that time had a total population of 33 million. 5 million may have gone to East Pakistan, which was very poor, had no way of supporting them. Such a state would collapse within days. And Jinnah, after all, was a politician par excellence, very quick to understand the situation. So I think that speech is meant to convince the Indian government that you take care of Muslims and we will take care of Hindus and Sikhs on our side. The irony, the tragedy, the success of Jinnah is that whereas in East Punjab, all the Muslims were expelled by the Sikh leadership, and we expelled all the Hindus and Sikhs. Uh, in the rest of India, where Congress had its stronghold, the Muslims who wanted to stay in India could stay on. They were 9.8% according to the division in 1947. Now they are 14.2, some say 15% Muslims. But already on our side, had all the Hindus and Sikhs in West Pakistan stayed on, they would be 21% of the population. But already by December 1947, all of them had been forced out or had left. And only 1.6% remained in Sindh interior. And to this day, the Hindu population of Pakistan, because we don't have East Pakistan anymore, is 1.6%. So that speech has to be contextualized in terms of Jinnah's genius to understand how to convince the Indian government not to push all the Muslims into Pakistan. And he succeeded.
Right, right. So going back to some of the more contested and thorny issues of that particular time, particularly the idea that the two nation theory, and I would come to that, but I think the first important area of historical investigation is how did this journey from an Indian nationalist, avowed Indian nationalist, ambassador of Hindu Muslim unity, that Mr. Jinnah was called, and his journey as a leader of the Muslims only, and culminating in the idea of two nation theory. So I think the viewers would be very much interested in that, because what happened throughout those decades, important decades, and also I will then follow up with what your thoughts and what you've written about the two nation theory, which is again a very contested subject.
Thank you very much. I think this is a very, very key question in order to unravel the enigma or the puzzle of the partition. What led Jinnah in that direction? Thank you very much for this question. No doubt, Muhammad Ali Jinnah began his career as a Indian nationalist. For example, he had not joined the Congress yet, but he was critical as a Bombay politician or public figure about the partition of Bengal. He thought dividing Bengal on the basis of religion was a stab in the back in the growing Indian nationalism. And that's not before until much later he joined, 1906, he joins the Indian National Congress. And in the Indian National Congress, there is enough evidence that he was a prominent leader, he was respected, and he led several delegations on behalf of the Congress. And the famous Lucknow Pact, people talk about Jinnah's commitment as a nationalist, very true and very correct description. But remember, it was the Indian National Congress which provided him the support for that. So one should not demean the support he got from the Congress to get the Lucknow Pact accepted. The Lucknow Pact gave over representation to the Muslims of the minority provinces, doubled their numbers, and reduced the representation of Muslims in the two provinces where they were in a majority. For example, Punjab and in Bengal. By up until then, Northwest Frontier was not yet a province, and Balochistan was not a province either. Okay, so that's when he was celebrated as the ambassador of Hindu-Muslim unity. Now the thing is, soon afterwards, Indian politics take a radical direction. And the direction is not because of Gandhi or Jinnah or anyone else, but primarily because of the British. You see, during the First World War, Indian opinion was very supportive of the British war effort. I think very generous donations were given, especially from the Punjab. And more than 1 million Indians, overwhelmingly from the Punjab, fought in the First World War for the British. So everybody was expecting that now, when we have served British interest, we will get some reform towards self-government. What the government does then is it imposes the draconian Rowlatt Acts,
Rowlatt Act, yeah.
which instead of giving self-government, gives the government the arbitrary powers to arrest people just on suspicion, on the fear that there was a conspiracy to overthrow the legitimate British government in India. Now, sidestepping, I think there is a problem to the Jinnah-Gandhi relationship as well. So if you allow, I want to say a few words.
Please, yeah.
You see, when Gandhi had earned a great reputation in South Africa, where he had gone basically to plead the case of a Muslim businessman, Mr. Khan. And then there, because of the racist laws, he organized the Indians and demanded some sort of rights and so on. So when he comes back to India in 1915, a reception was arranged for him by what is known as the Gujarar. This is the organization of the Gujarati-speaking people, all Gujarati-speaking people, where Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah read out the welcome address, and which was very laudatory of Gandhi and his services, and he was welcomed very warmly by Jinnah. Gandhi, when he gets up, he says something which came to haunt the Gandhi-Jinnah relationship thereafter, according to Walpott. But that was, he gets up and says, look, a Muhammadan leader is also here. And according to Walpott, his most famous biographer, this Jinnah took as a very mean act of Gandhi. Instead of calling him an an Indian leader, he had reduced him to a Mohammedan leader. So now this controversy was there. I wrote to his grandson, Rajmohan Gandhi, who's been to Pakistan, to explain why did his grandfather use these words. And his argument is that Gandhi had experience of Hindus, Muslims, and the rest working together in South Africa. And he was actually celebrating that now when he comes to India, all Gujaratis are here, Mohammedans and Hindus and the rest. So it was meant in good faith. But Walpert says that that's when Jinnah felt that Gandhi is reducing his stature as a leader. Then there are two, three other incidents where the fact is that he was heckled for speaking in English. Gandhi and his supporters wanted him to speak in Gujarati. And then finally, I think it is on the question of how to resist British draconian laws, Rowlatt Acts and so on. Gandhi ji started the non-cooperation movement, which was very radical, and Jinnah thought that that was the wrong thing to do. But on the Rowlatt Acts, if you look at the speech of Jinnah in the Imperial Legislative Assembly, which later on became the Central Legislative Assembly, it is a very, very radical condemnation of British rule. So up until then, there is no doubt that Jinnah was a true Indian nationalist. But now there is a problem between two giants, one Gandhi and one is Jinnah. Jinnah feels that he is the senior because he started in 1906. Gandhi comes in 1915, but he's captured the mood of the people by starting the civil disobedience movement. Gandhi ji got involved in the Khilafat movement. By the way, Jinnah is on record having gone to England to plead the case of the Ottoman Empire. I have given that evidence. And there is a statement of his also in support of the Ottoman Empire saying, first, the British took away our territories, now they want to take away our faith, which is the abolition of the caliphate. So there is no doubt that at that moment in time, the Muslim mood was one of great anger over British attitude towards the Ottoman Empire. But Gandhi, on the invitation of the radical ulama, then starts the civil disobedience movement, and that's where the break begins. I think Jinnah never forgave Gandhi for taking the movement out of his hands, which was to argue cases in the assembly and to go the constitutional way, whereas the masses were carried forward by Gandhi. Gandhi opened the Congress party to all Indians, whereas the Muslim League only became a mass party in 1939 or 1940, as late as that. It was an elitist party of only 1,500 people who paid an annual, fee, of which most of them were, they didn't even pay their annual donations, So the Muslim League gets mass character only in 1940. Congress becomes the leader of the freedom movement. Since Jinnah has stepped out of the Congress, after that, I have shown that for 10 years, Gandhi was in the wilderness because even in the Congress, there was a criticism of his radical politics. And had Jinnah stayed on, it's very possible he would have again regained the leadership. You make historical choices and then you have to live with them. So I've even humanized the situation of Gandhi and Jinnah, not necessarily being hostile to one another, but asserting their own way of being the leaders, and that coming into conflict.
Right. So on this quickly, just a follow-on point.
Yeah.
You said that he advocated for the Ottoman Empire.
Yes.
So then, why did he expressly oppose the Khilafat movement? I mean,
He
that
never
was
opposed. Absolute. He opposed taking this movement out in the streets. But insofar as the righteousness of the Muslims to have their Ottoman Empire, because the Sultan was symbolically or nominally considered the head of the Muslim world, at least of the Sunni Muslim world, and there is no doubt about it. He went on in a delegation to England pleading the case of the Ottomans. Then, as I quote this speech of his, it says, first you take away our territories because the Middle East territories were taken away. Now you want to take away our religious institutions or religion. So he is as strong a Muslim as anyone else you can quote. The difference is how to confront the British. And my argument is, how can you confront the British sitting in the Central Assembly? You can make one speech, and what more can you do? Going in the streets was not very helpful. That I can understand. But remaining in the Imperial Legislative Assembly and making one speech would not help preserve the Ottoman Empire either. So either you go out in the street and try your luck. I mean, let me give this example as an analogy. Right now, the Imran Khan government is being confronted by the PDM. They have threatened to go to Islamabad and all. In the hindsight of history, we would know whether this was a good decision or not. But you can understand that people may want to do this. So there is nothing wrong that Gandhi did it. And remember, it's the Muslims who came to Gandhi and not the other way around. And he accepted that because he wanted the Muslims to be part of the freedom struggle that he wanted for all Indians. So let's be fair to Gandhi as well. There is no opportunism involved. And Gandhi and Jinnah both were opposed to the abolition, the dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire. There is no difference between the two. It's only about the tactics and strategies, how to campaign for the Ottoman Empire. Both failed.
Right.
Yes.
Right. So, as you demonstrate in the book, and, building on these events in the 20s and the 30s and later on, Mr. Jinnah's formulation of the two-nation theory, I mean, not him, but there were others as well, as you mentioned earlier in your introduction. And, the rise of Muslim nationalism in India, in the British Indian context. So, while you are quite critical of that in the book, as I read through, and I'm also familiar with your earlier positions on that subject. So, but a lot of people today in Pakistan wonder, looking at what is happening in India right now under Prime Minister Modi, that two-nation theory was not all that bad an idea. So, how would you respond to that based on your historical research and the challenges of the present?
Okay, I think that's a very legitimate question, and a question with which I have battled myself a long time before writing the book. So, those who think that the hindsight of history confirms the two-nation theory, they are welcome to hold that opinion, because what is happening in India seems to confirm that. But let me present the counter argument. The counter argument is also what Jinnah said as an Indian nationalist. When the Lucknow Pact was agreed, there was a strong opposition from pro-British Muslim leaders that this will mean the rule of the Hindus. And I quote Jinnah saying that such affair is groundless. There is no chance that the Hindus will ever try to impose their religion or state on such an important minority. And why not? Let me back it up with material factors. One, Indian Muslims were a minority, correct, but they were located in the two most sensitive areas of the subcontinent, especially in the northwest. All invasions, apart from the sea, had come from the northwest. One, in the northwest frontier, they already had support of the Khudai Khidmatgar. So those Muslims were already with the Congress. Then in the northeast also, the Muslims were in a majority. That's one thing to consider. Can a Hindu majority impose its will in a subcontinent and get away with it, where in the two most sensitive areas, the overwhelming majority are Muslims? One. Second, if you look at the composition of the Indian army, British Indian army, Muslims until 1941 census were only 25% of the Indian population. You can count it anyway. but they were 38 to 42% in the Indian army. And in the police services, Muslims were overrepresented. In Punjab, we were 57.1, we were 73% in the police. In the UP, Muslims were only 14%, but I think they were up to 50% in UP. Then in Calcutta, Madras, Bombay, all these places, the British would take people from the northwest. They could be Sikhs, they could be Muslims, they could be Pathans, to keep those people down. You get the point. With such a obvious representation in the state services, because when a state imposes its will, it has the army and the military to do it. In both these services, the Muslims were overrepresented. And thirdly, you give me one example of any Congress leader, and especially, the Nehru report 1928, the Fundamental Rights report 1931, and people don't mention it. There was a 1931 special exemption given to all minorities to continue to apply their personal law. So the Congress and its leaders, Gandhiji was killed because of that, yaar. Who would deny that for the rights of Muslims? And if you want to discuss Nehru, I can do that with you as well. There is no record of the Congress wanting to establish a Hindu rule. Isn't Imran Khan the one who has said that he has been to India and seen the India of Nehru and Gandhi and it was different?
Yes, he did.
He did. So let's start with our own prime minister, and he speaks the truth. And the thing is that after he had made the 22nd March, people talk about the 23rd March Lahore resolution. I say that's not important. It's the 22nd March presidential address, very detailed, where he actually lays the foundational basis of the two-nation theory, using arguments which actually Chaudhry Rahmat Ali had developed, incorporating them in his idea of Hindu versus Muslim at all levels, eating, drinking water. I mean, all those divisions which existed, he emphasized as irreconcilable. Okay. So, thenceforth, he is into the division of India. And he uses all those arguments which would deny any chances of people living together because of their religious and cultural identities. Doing it would, in his mind, vindicate his right to be the leader. Okay, I can't be the leader of all Indians and Gandhi has stolen them from me, but I have shown that I am the leader of the Muslims and I've won for them a state. How that happened, under what circumstances, did Jinnah get the two-nation theory accepted by the British? That's the next question you can pose. But what I'm trying to say is there was no chance India could have been a Hindu state. One argument, and let me mention it. On the 30th of March 1941, at Kanpur, he was confronted by the Muslims. They said, after the Lahore resolution, that the Pakistan that you are wanting to create, well, there Pakistan already exists. All the elected governments are with Muslim chief ministers. What will happen to us? And then I quote him saying that I'll make 2 crore Muslims, 2 crore out of 9 crore. Actually, he should have said 3 crore, but let's say 2 crore Muslims taste martyrdom and get smashed. These are his words, not mine. In order to liberate 7 crore from Hindu Raj. He conflated Congress Raj with Hindu Raj, saying that Hindu Mahasabha and Congress are the same. Prime Minister Imran Khan doesn't accept it, and I think Imran Khan is right. There was a different India, and you know and I know that India is no more. So the question is, if you wanted 2 states for 2 nations, then all Muslims should have come to Pakistan. That would have been the a fair solution. Why didn't you Why didn't you encourage them to come to Pakistan? Actually, the 11th August speech is meant to discourage and to convince the Indian government not to push them across the border. So, all these controversies I've gone into detail, and you have read my arguments.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, I have, and I want to follow up, with this. You have outlined this peculiar shaping of politics and how the Muslim nationalist sentiment was, kind of Jinnah became a symbol
Quite right.
of that, and also appropriated that as well in his, as you rightly put in the book, in his very tactical and clever manner as a lawyer,
As a lawyer,
as
as
a
a
smart,
lawyer.
yeah, as a smart lawyer and a politician, I guess. But but then later on, events like, and you have devoted quite a bit of time and space in the book as well on the cabinet mission plan in 1946, which purportedly could have avoided the partition,
Quite.
and of course Nehru has been criticized for sabotaging that.
Okay.
And one of the questions from our audience also, I'd like to sort of link it to that, which is like, do you agree that it was Nehru's impatience and not Jinnah's demand which actually led to partition?
No, not at all.
Okay.
Let me shortcut it and come. I will look at the cabinet mission plan, but just to prove that about Nehru, they are absolutely wrong. Because in March 1947, in the interim government, finance minister, Congress, a Muslim, and presented a this budget.
Budget.
Okay, in the budget there was heavy taxation of big business, commerce, and industry, but nothing on land reforms, for example.
Hmm.
And I have quoted evidence that Nehru and the left wing of the Congress were willing to accept even then, and this is March 1947, to to continue with this, the budget idea and not to demand the partition. But it is the right wing of the Congress, Sardar Patel, who, and this is as late as March
47.
1947. In the cabinet mission plan, I have demonstrated at length that the British reason for having this sort of loose India with all powers vested in the center and, in the provinces, and the princely states more or less continuing as they did when they were under British paramountcy and leaving very little to the central government, was a non starter for any state of any consequence in the modern world. The central government must have effective authority to run the government. But the British wanted to retain the British Indian Army intact. They were still hoping to be the paramount power after they have transferred power. And they had imperial interest against the Soviet Union. And if you have read them, I've shown over and over again how the military generals discuss why the Soviet Union is the great danger and why India may align with them. And it's a very late arrival, sometimes in May 1947, that the British establishment decides to go for Pakistan and the partition. So you are right. The British intention was that they wanted a loosely united India in the hope that they would still continue to be the paramount sort of de facto in control of the subcontinent. But they are on record saying on the 12th of May 1947 that if partition happens, we shall ask Mr. Jinnah, who is willing to join the Commonwealth, to grant us access to Karachi port facilities, Pakistan airfields, and Muslim manpower. Manpower means the Pakistan military army, okay? Whereas Hindustan may go its own way. This is also on
Hmm.
record, which I have quoted. So it was a suspicion of Nehru that they went for partition and gave Jinnah the famously, notoriously description of a moth-eaten Pakistan. But
Yes.
the cabinet mission plan, and one point there, on the 6th of April 1946, uh, the mission tells Mr. Jinnah that if you can't show us how East and West Pakistan can create a credible defense structure, then you leave us no choice but to leave India united. And I think that's the ultimatum which Jinnah then realized, that if he were not to accept the cabinet mission plan, India could be left to the Congress on its own terms. So he makes an announcement on the 6th of June, many weeks later. In between, in the public, he continued saying, we want partition, we want partition, we want Pakistan. But then on the 6th of June, in a secret meeting of the Muslim League Council, it's called in camera, he says, accept my advice, let's accept the cabinet mission plan. The idea of Pakistan in the shape of 3 groups is already granted, and we will, in 10 years, we will have the right to, and we'll work towards Pakistan. And so accepting the cabinet mission plan was a way of preempting or preventing the British leaving India in the hands of the Indian National Congress. But one point before we move forward, even when he accepted the cabinet mission plan, the second part of the plan was that all parties will sit in the Constituent Assembly and prepare the Constitution of India, which he refused, which the Muslim League refused. The Congress rejected the cabinet mission plan but accepted the Constituent Assembly to go there and make a constitution for India. So even then the record has to be put straight, you know. It's a conditional acceptance on both sides, but different aspects.
Yeah, but I mean, Dr. Sab, and you've actually addressed one of the audience questions also. So one viewer had asked, how does the creation of Pakistan play out in the larger Cold War scenario?
Yes.
And you've adequately addressed that. But I think on the cabinet mission plan, the important point there is that Jinnah did move back from the maximalist position.
Quite right. And that's granted. That's granted. He did it because he was given it would be a fait accompli otherwise. The British then leaving, if he doesn't agree, they leave it India to the Congress to run its own way. So for him, this was a tactical way of preventing that from happening. And that makes a lot of sense. Absolutely. And he says, accept my advice because we still work towards Pakistan. Only we, all this time he had been saying, we'll bring the Muslims out. The Muslims are a martial people. They know how to use guns. And the Hindus are, I've quoted all those speeches people never refer to. So in the public realm, he keeps the hype up, but then he does it on the 6th of June. And then on the 25th, Muslim League accepts, the Congress rejects. But what the Muslim League accepts is just the cabinet mission plan, but not the Constituent Assembly to make a constitution for India. And India and the Congress rejects the cabinet mission plan because they said any respecting government without an effective center is a non-starter, and this is true. Just see when Pakistan came into being, how centralized a state Mr. Jinnah himself created. We have a greater problems with our provinces. 18th Amendment is still not operational, but they have been able to provide them the under a
provincial rights
in India. So just using an argument doesn't make much sense if you're a political scientist. It was a non-starter. India wouldn't have lasted a day. And remember, the princely states were free to just give foreign affairs and defense to the Union government. Let's say the Indian National Congress and Muslim League, hypothetically I'm speaking, they wanted to have universal adult franchise, but you couldn't force the princely states to accept them because they had not agreed. this would be a fiasco. It wouldn't last a single day. No state can function without a coherent formula of how to run the state. So I think the Congress position was based on sound political theory. And Jinnah, when he got Pakistan, some of his actions are in that direction to make an effective center.
Right, right. So we have, last few minutes, about 8 to 9 minutes. So I'm going to take a lot of questions from the audience. I mean, I still have many. I'll try and blend my questions with them. So one a very interesting question from one of the viewers here is why did no alternative leadership develop in the Muslim League to Jinnah, while in Congress they had several tiers of leaders even at the top.
I can't answer that question. I think Mr. Jinnah was too towering a leader. This I grant throughout my book. And most Muslim League leader of the second stature were, they were not very charismatic, and they didn't have that sort of national character. And most of his peers were gone. Sir Agha Khan was dead. Mia Fazle Hussain was dead. Mia Sir Muhammad Shafi was dead. All those who could compete with him. And then in Bengal also, naturally, nature had taken them away, and it was only Jinnah then left who could lead the Muslims. And once you give one person so much power, it is also something which actually harms the leader and the people.
Yes, and there's another question which is linked to this and which is kind of linked to what your comment earlier, that Jinnah was a constitutionalist.
Yeah.
But why did he act vice-regal after becoming the Governor General of Pakistan?
Well, now that's a very good question. First of all, constitutionalism he gave up, and there is a speech saying that I think it's on the 29th of July 1946, that from now on we leave the constitutional methods, and I'm holding a silver pistol in my hand. And that results in the direct action in Calcutta on the 16th of August 1946. And several thousand people are killed. Then in Bihar, few weeks later, there is a massacre of Muslims. Then it comes to Hazara district in northwest frontier, and then the Punjab. So once communal violence crept in, constitutionalism was really rendered redundant to what was happening. And so I think, isn't that the question?
Yes, yes. I mean, they're saying that his conduct was more of a viceroy.
Yes, quite right. So once he becomes the Governor General of Pakistan, I think he commits another major error. And this I must say. And I've quoted Khalid bin Said and Alan McGrath's. There's a book, The Destruction of Pakistan Democracy, published by Oxford University Press, both books. So these are bona fide Pakistani publications, where they show that Jinnah actually acquired extraordinary powers which even the viceroys never had. And he dismissed an elected government in Northwest Frontier without any good reasons. He dismissed the Sindh government, which was a Muslim League government, simply because Ayub Khodu was not willing to let Karachi become federal territory. He said that it was the main city of Sindh, so it should remain in Sindh. And then he goes to Dhaka and makes a statement that Urdu will be the national language of Pakistan, when 55% of the population of Pakistan, which is Bengalis, were not Urdu speaking. Well, even here there were no Urdu speakings, but people could converse in Urdu. So all this is using excessive power, and the Prime Minister and the rest not daring to question him. He acquired so much power, and he got so much submission from his Prime Minister and ministers, that virtually that's acting, I think, like an all-powerful vice-regal sort of ruler, more than what the viceroys had constitutionally.
Yeah, but I mean, so here's a counterpoint to your comment. And Dr. Saab, don't you think that a new nation state, and you already highlighted the problems with two nation theory, the way
Yeah,
it was constructed, a lot of it was kind of invented
yeah,
as we went along.
yeah.
So maybe I think Jinnah had to acquire those powers, because I mean there's a state building project underway as well.
Okay. I would grant that point. I'm just saying I can understand what happened, but I'm showing
Mm.
the consequences which followed.
Right, right.
So you see, in my case, I do all this research in an analytical manner.
Of course.
I show the consequences and I don't take a moral position.
Hmm.
For
Hmm.
me, the consequences are there. Those who followed after him, they followed the viceregal system until when? When did we have an end to dictatorship?
Oh my
Post
God. I mean,
1970, the first elections, yeah.
yes,
And
1970.
once the elections were held, we lost half our country.
Yeah,
So
we
the
didn't transfer
consequences,
power.
yes.
Yeah, yeah,
So the
yeah.
executive has always overstepped its powers. But this tradition, whether of necessity, and I can understand Jinnah thought that without him, Pakistan can go astray. So his leadership was needed. Fine. I mean, that happens. But some of the consequences of his decisions are contentious. Let's say that. They are
Right.
questionable, or we can discuss them. I'm not
Yes, yes.
I'm not questioning his sincerity. There's 110%. I'm just saying these are the consequences.
Yeah, there were consequences, and as you very rightly said, that until 1970, we stayed stuck in that vice regal sort of
Exactly. Yeah.
system. So one other question from the audience, and it is that did Jinnah have an economic policy?
No, let me point out that Jinnah was rabidly anti socialist, anti communist. I have quoted in
Mhm.
the book, I think, on three occasions, and this is for the left to listen, where he pointedly says, I'm warning the communists. Do they think we are fools? They should not try to capture the Muslim League. We have our own Islamic ideology, and hands off to all isms: socialism, communism, national socialism. These are the three words he uses. So he was not interested in going towards the Soviet Union. He was very much in favor of allying Pakistan with the US. He was a self-made man who through hard work had earned a huge income and lived a life of luxury and comfort. So he believed in the private initiative of the individual. And but now, when Pakistan was created, he once again creates an Islamic reconstruction department in the Punjab and invites Alama Muhammad Asad, formerly Leopold Weiss, an Austrian Hungarian Jew who converted to Islam, to head that. And it was to advise the government of Pakistan on the constitution, on the Islamic system of Pakistan, and on the educational system to make Pakistan Islamic but in a democratic, progressive way. This was what Jinnah wanted, and the Muslim modernists are right. This is the type of thing Jinnah wanted. Somehow that Pakistan should be Muslim and democratic in some sense. I've shown how that is very difficult, if not impossible.
Yeah, that's what your thesis to in the final chapters. That's the central underlying argument, that
That's
some of the things that Pakistan has faced in recent years and the challenges it faces of extremism, etc. You link them back to the kind of genesis and two nation theory.
quite right.
So I mean, I guess we have just last 2 minutes. So there's one other question. Maybe you could quickly address this from the audience, and we must take them. That do you agree with Maya Tudor's argument that the real failure was the weakness of the Muslim League itself?
Well, that's an obvious, self evident truth. One need not. Jinnah is on record saying that I and my typewriter uh, created
Made
Pakistan. And
yeah.
this is true. The Muslim League was a hurried collection of all those people who didn't want the Congress to rule India with its anti zimidari landlord reforms and towards a socialist India. Even the Congress rejected Nehru's idea of a socialist India. I've given that. Six of the leading Congressites resigned from the Congress when Jinnah Nehru made this speech. And in any case, the Muslims, landlords, hurried to the Muslim League without having any common shared ideals except to prevent India coming under Congress rule. So the Muslim League was a collection of regional interests and politicians who had nothing common among them. That's the problem. The Muslim League was no real political party. It was a mob movement actually, which hurriedly captured the fancy of the people and got Pakistan because the British wanted to create a Pakistan as a frontline state against the Soviet Union. And then,
Right.
yeah, that's how I see it.
Yes, yes, indeed, and I guess that was the failure of Muslim League in so many ways in Pakistan's early history. Resulted in some of the destruction of democracy, constitutionalism that you cite and others have also cited. So I guess one parting comment, Dr. Saab, today's Pakistan. What can based on your both historical study of Mr. Jinnah, but also your earlier work, which is about the garrison state, about the civil military relations, the genesis. What is today's Pakistan can do to reset its course? That Muslim modern ideal that you also mentioned. I mean, how can we get there? I mean, we know that there are these historical
Okay.
issues, but I'd like to hear from you on that one.
I think the 1956 constitution was very close to what is called as a Muslim democracy. It was only the president who was supposed to be a Muslim, and there was going to be some sort of effort to make the laws compatible with Quran and Sunnah. That was another thing, and there was going to be an Islamic advisory council or something. You know, if we return to just that spirit and let modern educated Muslims go on to build some sort of a Muslim nation, they have a chance. But if you bring in more and more of this fundamentalist, anti intellectual, intolerant, sectarian, subsectarian way of thinking, then you are doomed.
Hmm.
So you have to make your own choices. Let me, say like this. Today, Pakistan with 22 crore people, 220 million people, is the sixth largest state in the world. It is a nuclear power which can deter all attacks on it. So nobody can really attack Pakistan and break it up. So this whole fear of an Indian invasion is greatly exaggerated if it is not entirely a you know
A myth,
min-
you mean?
manipulation of the fears of people. Huh?
Right, right.
I don't
Dr.
think
Saab,
I don't think the Indians want Pakistan and the Muslims back. History has decided there will be an India and there will be a Pakistan. We can live in peace and benefit from that.
yes, especially under Mr. Modi's India. Well, I wish we had more time because there's so much to talk to you about, but hopefully we'll have follow on conversations. Thank you very much, viewers, for participating in this session. Hopefully, we've addressed all your questions, and thank you, Dr. Saab, for your time and really illuminating conversation. And congrats on the book once again.
Thank you very much. You have been very kind, very generous to me and to the listeners and to those who called, gave in
Fantastic.
questions. My salam to all of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.